Hi there, I'm Sean Cummings. I'm the author of, this here new book called Immortal Remains, a Tim Reaper novel. And it's just become available now on the 13th of July. And I thought I would take part in what a lot of folks are doing right now on Facebook by reading the first chapter. Little backstory. The character Tim Reaper first appeared about 6 years ago in this book. Called Funeral Parlor, and he was sort of a secondary character, and I got a lot of really good response from people that liked him and said, hey, when's there going to be a Tim Reaper book? So I finally wrote a Tim Reaper book, and here it is. So I'm going to read the first chapter, and I hope you get a kick out of it. Chapter 1, 1919. It is a terrible thing to watch a child die. It is worse still when you carry the secret knowledge that a child's death is your fault. I observed the scene around the little boy's bedside. It should have been easy for me as I had witnessed the conclusion of a life lived countless times in the past. This particular scene should have been no different than what happens in millions of hospitals and homes around the globe at all hours, every day and every night. The dying time, a unit measured by fever and failing organs and the seemingly endless final moments, each attuned but to a fate set out by powers greater than mine from the moment of birth. The grieving parents wore linen face masks as they hovered over the dying child, whose face resembled some ghastly china doll. He might as well have been made of porcelain, because the flu hit him hard and fast, smashing its way through his immune system, shattering any hope of a future into a million tiny shards. He was only 9 years old, and his body betrayed him. Disease kicked his hopes and dreams to the gutter. It stabbed his mother in the abdomen, in the very womb from which he emerged only 9 short years ago, and she would never be the same. She would blame herself until the day one of my kind comes to claim her. The loss of her only child will poison her mind, her life, and her marriage until such a point that her husband leaves her for another less guilt-ridden woman, because that is how this particular grieving family will play itself out. I caused this. These final seconds, like countless others occurring at the very same moment, only divided by human constructs like time and faith, is overseen by those who facilitate the natural order of things. Like me, we passively watch life's end unfold until our shadow-like hands gently brush the collective faces of our intended, and we whisper the words of timeless, ageless, and limitless ending. Come with me, I whispered softly in the little boy's ear as I touched my cold finger against his clammy cheek. He let out a sudden, sharp gasp, a gulp of air from a drowning soul. A full life was his birthright, and I took it from him. I snatched it away. He emitted a last desperate breath, and then my intended slowly exhaled, that final breath leaving his lungs like the air being slowly released from a balloon. His heart stopped beating within a microsecond, and that's when the tears began to flow. This was the start of my punishment. The little boy was to be the last soul I would ever claim. There must have been some kind of symbolism in it having to be a child, though I didn't have a freaking clue what meaning could ever be drawn from what I had just done. His lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling. They looked through it, actually, and it was in the very next moment that I felt his soul emerge from the same body that once skated on the frozen edges of a lake with his pals. The child's mother let out a haunted, painful wail as she drove her face into her dead child's now motionless chest and sobbed. The flickering image of the boy stood before his mother and reached out to her, his near translucent hand passing through her flesh. The angel of death and transformation appeared a second or so later, a rarity because he never shows up at death's side. And that's always been a Reaper's job. He fired a contemptuous glare my way, and his features softened as he knelt before the visage of the dead boy. Take my hand, child, Ezekiel said in a voice so filled with tenderness that I couldn't believe this was the same holy being that unleashed hell on earth in Egypt nearly 3,000 years ago. The boy reached out, and at that moment his hand touched Ezekiel, holy light filled the room. A host of angels sang his praise, and the light diminished until there was only a crying mother hugging her dead child's body as the grief-stricken father looked on. I created the cataclysm that unleashed death on a scale not seen since the Middle Ages. It had been grinding at me for the last dozen or so souls that I'd claimed, why must anyone die when death itself tears apart those who are left behind? My role had always been clear. I understood the natural order of things for millennia. I never questioned Yet doubts crept in like winter chills seeping through the cracks in a wall. There was something about claiming the souls of children that always haunted me. This one certainly wasn't the first child I'd taken. Yet with each dying child I encountered, I noticed they, more than anyone else, fought me the hardest right up until their last breaths. And it bothered me to see the end of innocence when so many that I'd claimed were as far from innocent as you can get. It angered me. It was unjust. And that's so completely unlike me. No, seriously, I've waited passively while a madman walked into a shipping office in London with a shotgun and 2 revolvers, blasting away at anything that moved. He killed 8 people, and me? I just observed the proceedings, completely oblivious to the horrifying carnage. And the worst part? I wasn't there to claim any of the 8 victims. He was for me. It was my job to claim the crazy person the moment he fired both barrels straight to his mouth. There were 8 other death dealers milling about, each assigned to claim the souls of his victims. They too were as oblivious as me. That's how it works, by the way. We claim one of you at a time, no more and no less. It's always been like that. The little boy who died of the flu was to be my last. After he disappeared, I too disappeared. But only for a short time. Look, the arbitrary nature of what I do is cosmic cement that binds all living things to the fate. It's not ever to be fucked with. Yet there I was, drifting through the organic constructs of the living en route to the drunken man. The war had ended more than 9 months earlier, and all over the world the dying continued on a biblical scale. I was alone for the very first time, yet I knew the lure of living energy would be too much to bear. I decided to sample people's lives, to drink in their life force, to experience fleeting glimpses into those seemingly unimportant gifts to the living, which are too quickly forgotten. The feel of the wind blowing gently through your hair, or the warmth of the mid-morning sun against your skin. I decided to sample their lives like a judge at a wine tasting competition. I'd feel the constant thump, thump, thump of a beating heart, and then on to the next for another small moment. I look upon all there is to see through their living eyes, then on to another and another still, hopping from one person to the next, each body a mere stepping stone, until I spotted him, the drunken man. I knew his end was near because we all see everyone's end. It's what we do. A thought occurred to me. What if I use him? What might happen? Anything would be better than an eternity's existence as an intangible cloud of energy stealing glimpses into people's lives. He staggered hard up a steep incline, completely blind to the approach of the streetcar that was about to clip him as it rumbled toward the stop, not more than half a block away. I hopped into the body of the homeless man who was squatting in a gully taking a shit. I heard a thud and watched the drunken man's feet leave the ground after the streetcar struck him. Another of my kind appeared beside his body as it lay bleeding on a patch of grass. It greeted the now dead man's luminous form and escorted him away. As soon as the 2 were gone, I made my move. I drove my essence straight into his central nervous system. He'd been dead for less than a minute, and I wasted no time getting him to draw a breath. An electric jolt shot through his heart, and it quickly began to beat. I blinked 3 times and drew in a cleansing breath of air. The body began to spasm for a few seconds, just long enough for me to acquaint myself with the host's new functions. When the twitching stopped, I pulled myself up off the grass. My head was spinning like a turbine, and I felt a splash of nausea roll about in the pit of my stomach. A cloud of choking dust swirled around my face as another streetcar zipped by. I turned around and looked at the spot where I'd just resurrected a dead man. I saw the pool of blood along with a crisp grayish-brown human-shaped impression in the grass where my host had been only a few seconds ago. Every living thing within a few feet of where I stood was dead. I glanced down at my hands and saw blood mixed with tiny flecks of dirt and a pair of long grass stains that stretched from the heel of my hands up to my wrists. The drunken man was gone, and I was alive for the very first time. My lips curled up into a smile. His name was Amos Regan, and he'd been in America for 25 years. He'd worked with his hands back in the old country, but it was the new land that he discovered the lure. But it was in the new land that he discovered the lure of the drink. Dirt cheap American whiskey warmed his insides on those cold mornings working the docks, loading and unloading Great Lakes ships with names like Ojibwa and Algonquin. Liquor drove away his wife and family. She'd taken the kids and run off after he slapped her around one too many times. He poured his worth into yet more drink night after night, picking fights for spare change and pummeling the faces of those who gave him any lip in one of the many saloons he frequented near Dockside. He made quick cash doing side jobs for any gang in need of an enforcer. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, so it was a surprise to me that his life ended by accident instead of by design. I simply carried on where Amos left off, drinking because drunkenness was a new sensation, brawling because the lure of bashing a man into submission excited the basest parts of my being, and doing odd jobs with a knife or a gun or a lead pipe. His nature became my second nature. I reveled in sexual escapades with the whores near Dockside because it was cheap and new. I fashioned knuckle dusters which I wore underneath my woolen gloves during Detroit's bitterly cold winters because there was always someone in need of a beating whenever I needed hard cash. I could find anyone anytime for easy money, but things quickly changed the day when I first encountered a human being with no soul. I cast my gaze upon him as he stood in a lineup at the bank. He was dressed in a tweed cap and blue denim overalls. He carried an aluminum lunchbox, and his hands were black from fitting pipes or shoveling coal in one of the boilers for the new skyscrapers being constructed in Detroit at the time. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, because all around me the living energy of dozens upon dozens of souls thrummed with percussive intensity. Everyone except him. I thought for a moment that he might be one of my kind, another defrocked reaper who'd figured out how to live in the body of a dead man. I followed him as he left the bank. I stayed a good 20 paces behind, lighting up a cigarette and bumping into the occasional pedestrian that hot August afternoon. We both hopped a streetcar and rode for 20 minutes until we reached a series of dilapidated row houses near the docks. I stopped dead in my tracks when I caught a glimpse of 3 reapers waiting patiently in front of the house. They spotted me and raged, the ancient words spilling out of their mouths like a foul torrent in some polluted spillway. I was the forsaken one. I wasn't fit to be in their presence. I was the usurper who openly challenged the will of the Almighty. I shut out their anger because what I was looking at just didn't add up. Unless the house was about to burst into flames, killing everyone inside, it was a rare occurrence to see 3 death dealers hanging around outside of a home. I needed information. I waited until nightfall, the entire time keeping an eye on the front door and the reapers, whose vaporous forms resembled clouds of ink floating and bobbing in still water. I needed information about the man with no soul. But I just couldn't barge into his place without knowing whether or not he was some elemental being or possibly someone from the pits of you-know-where. After sucking back yet another cigarette, I squatted against the wall of a small brick apartment building and shut my eyes. I reached out, willing the tiniest fragment of my essence forward, so tiny that, with a little luck, I wouldn't rouse the suspicion of the creatures holding vigil outside of the Skid Row house. And, naturally, that didn't work one tiny bit. The 3 reapers immediately detected my presence and went for me, twisting my essence, pulling it in different directions. I cupped my hands over my ears to blot out the sounds of their recriminations and cursing. They spat out words so foul that each syllable threatened to poison the very air that I was breathing. I grated my teeth together and stood up. I pointed at the death dealers and barked a curse at them in the ancient tongue of our kind. I spoke the words no human was ever to speak, and it so horrified the creatures that they recoiled at my power. And so I latched onto their essence until I could see through their eyes. My mind filled with the image of 3 women locked in a dark room. I saw a rope hanging from the ceiling. I could smell shit and piss. I could taste the coppery tang of blood in my mouth, and I could feel the burn as his knife cut into their backs, just enough to draw blood. His task was clear. He cared little for the women and cared a lot for the skin on their backs, because each presented a blank canvas for a new work of art. Each cut was like the stroke of an artist's brush. He needed them alive long enough for their skin to heal. There would be bright red scars that stood out against their ivory skin with intensity so pure that he would drop to his knees and weep in thanksgiving for his artistic gifts. He no longer needed the women at this point, for their bodies were mere easels for his human canvas underneath the floorboards, and underneath the floorboards were 7 other completed works. These 3 made 10, and his task would be complete. He could then assemble each panel on the wall of his home before spilling his own blood as an offering to the art he created. He would be dead, but his art would live on in a portrait gallery or a museum, perhaps. A wave of anger hit me with enough force that I staggered for a moment or two. Inside that shithole house were 3 women, and the man with no soul was some kind of sick fuck with dreams of artistic glory. He had already killed 7 women. These 3 were to be his last. I removed my gloves and adjusted my knuckle dusters as I marched up to the front door. I pounded it 4 times with enough force that the entire door frame shook. He opened the door, and I didn't give him enough time to formulate his next move. I drove my right fist into his face with a loud crunch. He dropped to his knees, and I sent a size 12 right into his chest. He toppled over as I kicked the door closed, and then I drove my left fist into his throat. It crushed his windpipe, and he immediately began making choking sounds. I grabbed his left arm, and I dragged him down a hall filled with rodent droppings. I followed my nose. The stench of urine and feces was so strong that it burned with each breath into my lungs. I found the room with the 3 women, and I kicked the door open, still pulling the soulless man behind me. I wanted him to see what I was going to do to his masterpiece. In front of me were 3 shirtless women, their hands bound tightly with rope. Each was hanging by their own metal hook, that had been drilled into a supporting wall. Their backs were a mass of scab-covered lines and circles, and their skirts were covered with dried blood. They'd been hanging there for a long time, as there was piss and shit smeared all over the floor and all over their bare feet. They each twisted around to see me standing there with the soulless man, choking at my feet. Their battered and bruised faces lit up as their eyes gazed down at the madman who was dying by inches on the filth-covered floor. I spotted a butcher's roll on a small table. I dashed across the room and pulled out a filleting knife and proceeded to cut the women's bonds. "You're free, ladies," I said as I handed them each a knife from the butcher's roll. "Why don't you three make some art out of this asshole, seeing as how that was his plan for you?" One of them glanced at the knife and then looked at me in the eyes. How did you find us?" she croaked. I shrugged as I backed up to the doorway. "Call it divine intervention. You won't see me again. Goodbye." I drove my boot into the soulless man's face as the three women descended on him like vultures to carrion, and the last thing I heard as I headed out the door was a snit, snit, snit of razor-sharp blades stabbing into his flesh over and over and over again. I nodded to the three reapers as I walked out onto the street. "I bet you pricks didn't see that coming," I said, lighting up a cigarette. "Tell Ezekiel to go fuck himself." So there you go. That's the first chapter of Immortal Remains. It's available on Amazon in paperback or as a Kindle book, and it's available as EPUB. So I hope you liked it, and I hope you enjoyed the sound of my voice reading my book. Thanks for watching.